You are going to find out that all churches in Canada that are CRA charities own zero assets. They can be taken away at any time at the government's whim.
They lose all of their assets, right?
The law is on their side, not your side. And unfortunately, there seemed to be almost no remedy to get our churches back to be real churches in Canada, to have their assets back to them instead of giving money to the church, which then builds the government's assets. The government owns the land, your pews, your video equipment, your buildings, everything. And that can be taken away at a moment's notice. Scary stuff. So check out the interview. Please like and subscribe and share this around. If you are a pastor or a concerned member of a church or something like that, please reach out to me and let's have a discussion. And if you are not a charity and you were thinking to go that route, which pastors set up other pastors, and it's a cycle thinking that this is the right thing to do when in fact it's the opposite. There are some solutions that we've actually come up with and discovered after the fact, because I researched this for years, and finally some solutions came to light, and I'll address those at the end. Okay, guys, enjoy the interview with Adam.
Your questions have actually raised a really interesting public policy point. I was thinking about it because if you are a charity and you want to, first of all, I should say that the government has an interest in having fewer charities. Obviously, fewer charities, then there's, first of all, it's more efficient, and secondly, it's less tax receipts being issued. Now, currently, if an organization wants to give up their charitable status, they lose all of their assets, right? What you're suggesting is, well, we should have a mechanism whereby they just give up their charitable status but don't lose all their assets, which currently is really, it's unlikely to happen. But, if there were a provision for that actually might be in the government's interest as well. So it's an interesting thought.
Well, and that was on my topic on the annulment, correct?
That's exactly it. Yeah.
I'm glad you kind of bring it up, and we'll get to that as kind of part of the talk. I'm very curious about little things like Bill C-16 literally can change the law, and therefore theoretically could initiate a mass kind of like chain reaction amongst, say, religious organizations that now should be annulled, because they would then, if they're against certain things, transgender or something like that, if that literally, anytime the government changes the law, theoretically there could be a whole amount of charities that now no longer qualify.
Well,
right?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, because there's a difference between objects and activities, right? So, on the object side, very few churches or any organization is set up in such a way that a new law would indicate that they are offside what they're doing. For example, saying, we now outlaw Buddhism, such that that is no longer charitable. It's more likely that their activities are offside, so that you have a church which and same-sex marriage was a perfect example.
Yep.
Many churches, of course, don't allow same-sex marriage, and many religious organizations generally, and the law came in allowing same-sex marriage, and so the churches actually went to Prime Minister Martin at the time and asked him to include a provision in the Income Tax Act saying that churches that refuse to sanctify same-sex marriage won't lose their charitable status for the exact purpose. It was the exact situation, but that was a situation. I think it was overkill. I don't think they could have, in fact, lost their charitable status for that.
And I really appreciate you and your including your entire firm's angle on both bringing legal advice to this sphere and clarity, but also your layman kind of regular vocabulary, which you don't always find when dealing with lawyer firms and whatnot. So I really appreciate all your guys' articles, and that's what attracted me to. I read through a ton of them, and then I just definitely appreciated your guys' your wording. So I said I had to get a hold of you guys. So I'll tell you that just your layman non-lawyerese is what kind of won me over. So.
Well, we appreciate it. We try to talk straight.
Thank you very much for allowing us to interview you, Adam. So can you just spend a moment or two and kind of just give us a sense of who you are and kind of your expertise in this background, and even how you kind of came to maybe even specialize in kind of charity type work?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't get that one asked every day. I'll start from the beginning. I went to law school with an interest specifically in tax law, and came out and articled in a firm doing tax litigation, which again was exactly my intent. And somewhere along the line in my first year, I ended up with a case involving disallowed donation tax credit, and of obviously an individual who had donated to charity, but he had passed away. And so the question came up, did he or did he not actually donate to this charity? And it was not only interesting, but it was a little more fulfilling and satisfying than dealing with the typical tax litigation questions I was dealing with at the time. And so I developed more of an interest in charities, and not just donating to charities, but also the way charities operate. And many of your listeners might not know this, but the guts of charity regulation actually is within the Income Tax Act. And so my background in tax was particularly useful in developing a practice in the regulation of charities. And so that's how my career developed. And in the past 15 years or so, I've developed my practice significantly. I write quite a bit on the topic. I've given expert testimony on Parliament Hill. I've actually suggested or made suggestions which were then contained within private members' bills to change the law as far as charities go. And I argue in front of the courts. So I've argued at the Tax Court, the Federal Court of Appeal, and the Supreme Court. So that's a little bit about me. And like I said, I've written. Well, I think you're going to mention about the book that I wrote on starting and maintaining a charity in Canada. I also have written papers for the Bar Association and for the C.B. Howe Institute. So I think that's enough of the background.
I definitely value your time, and definitely encourage others, the listeners and stuff like that, to definitely seek legal counsel, appropriate legal counsel, because just kind of, I'm guessing as a caveat to this is, anything that we talk about here at the moment is definitely for research purposes, just to get you thinking and to definitely get you in touch with folks like yourself so that they can definitely explore these options in a legal manner. Would that be fair to say? And
Sure,
kind of cover?
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, no, we like helping charities, and of course, the way we help is to make sure they're doing things legally. So all that makes sense.
And you've mentioned it a bunch of times in your book, which is really great, and including a bunch of your articles, is just setting people up to the seriousness of setting up a charity. It's not just, hey, let's sign a few pieces of paper or something and get the ability to be tax-free and issue tax receipts. There's definitely a lot of serious consequences to that. And on my reading, a bit of my background and the reason why it kind of concerned me and started my whole scope here in terms of the research, hey, being a charity actually does come with a lot of not just pros, some of these tax rebate or exemptions and things like that, but it also comes with a lot of restrictions. And the more of those I read, I became a little bit concerned. And then that's kind of got me down the rabbit trail of the CRA website. Now kind of brought me to talk to somebody like yourself that goes, okay, I believe I'm reading the website correctly, but let's get this in layman terms a little bit, mixed with a little bit of dialogue so people do understand it and go, okay, this is maybe a little bit more serious than we expect, and or do we even apply to be a charity, or do we currently applicable, or maybe we're now in violation of the charity kind of status, and what do we do about that? And or do we even want to continue to be a charity, which is kind of some of the questions that we have for today. Anything you'd like to speak on just the general seriousness of being a charity?
Yes. I think you summarized that part well. I've advised clients, and I know my colleagues in the bar in various parts of the country. One of the first questions they ask people that want to set up a charity is, do you really need this? Do you really want to get into it? charities have special privileges. Obviously, they can issue receipts for gifts made to them, which effectively subtract from the government's tax revenues. And so as a result, the government has all sorts of rules in place to make sure that those revenues, which would otherwise go into the country's general revenues, are properly being used for charitable purposes. And those restrictions are quite severe. It's a serious obligation, and the obligations of making sure not only that you comply with the law, but that you've got administrative procedures in place to show that you've complied with the law should the government ever ask, are onerous. And a question which should be asked of anybody that wants to be a charity: do you really want to get into this? And what's more is that there can be personal obligations and liabilities imposed specifically on directors if they are not engaged properly in the administration of the charity. So, I think you put it right. That's a serious obligation. And, a lot of times the problem is you have well-meaning folks that want to help on any given issue, whether it's helping, people who are unfortunately afflicted with disease or with monetary problems, or they've been victims of a disaster, or it's environmental, or it's a religious organization, or what have you. They're well-meaning people, but they're not necessarily knowledgeable about the obligation, and so they can often get themselves into problems because they are acting again because they're well-meaning, but with from a position of ignorance. And so, part of what we try and do, and one of the reasons I wrote the book, was to help educate people that mean well but don't know what they're getting themselves into.
And and I love some of your comments throughout the book and some of your articles. Is you've written here on registering a charity that there's at times that there's tremendous misunderstandings, and unfortunately too, because of both the specificness of different parts of the website and of the writings and of the vagueness, it actually is, I've kind of termed it that it's like house rules when you're gambling. Is eventually the house is always going to win because the rules are set for the house to win, and there's just so many things that can go in the favor of the government if they ever were to choose to pull the rug out from underneath you, I suppose. And this is kind of where we're going to get into is some of the consequences of what it looks like if you choose to give up your charitable status or the government chooses for you that you are no longer a charity, and what some of those consequences are. But it seems like the rules are definitely stacked in the favor of the government.
Well, I think that there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, if they have the power to write new rules. Now, the only real protection, of course, is the Constitution, the Charter of Rights, the Bill of Rights, perhaps, and certain very fundamental protections we have. But, and I think a lot of people read the Charter and think that, freedom of speech or freedom of association, I can say what I want, or I can do what I want and whatnot, don't necessarily realize that those protections aren't as obvious as it would seem, or as widespread as they may seem. There's a lot of restrictions on freedom of expression, for example, which are allowed by the courts, and legal restrictions. And so people may think that, I'm going to rely, speaking of charities, and look at political advocacy. It's freedom of speech. I can say what I want. There are limits to that as well, and they don't necessarily mean that every charity can be a charity and still speak their mind. So I think that's something your listeners should be aware of.
There's kind of two areas that definitely concern me with charities, and it's rated kind of when you first sign up to be a charity and stuff like that. It actually asks, here are the different factors that will prevent your organization from being a charity. And the two main headlines are kind of political purposes and activities that are illegal or contrary to Canadian public policy. And I'm just wanting kind of your paraphrasing of that, because to me, I kind of read some of that is like for the political purposes, it says, an organization can't it says the courts have determined anything is political if you try to retain, oppose, or change any laws or policies of any, this is crazy, of any level of government, including in Canada and foreign countries. So you can't even speak into other countries' policies potentially, and that's, I think that's a huge topic right there. And then the other thing is just anything that is deemed contrary to Canadian public policy, i.e. laws. And I just think that's huge. And some, potentially even religious organizations, well, they would be in blatant violation of maybe their identity if they think maybe they have freedom to speak about these things. But is it true potentially once they go from being, whatever they were before to becoming a charity, are those activities and freedoms of speeches, or would it be fair to say that they're definitely more restricted?
Well, I think we all know that they're more restricted. So yes, of course. I think that one of the, first of all, you have to understand that there's a couple different issues involved here. The issues on charities being restricted in engaging in political activities is not a new one. It really goes back to an old case decided in England, I think in the early 70s perhaps, called McGovern, which basically said that charities are organized to pursue certain charitable objects. A court can look at those objects and say yes or no, those are or are not charitable. The problem with the political activities is that the court's really not in a position, at least this was their logic, I'm not sure I buy it, but that a court's not really in a position to say, yeah, that political activity is really going in pursuit of a charitable object, such that, for example, they said, well, I can't tell you that, you lobbying to reduce the blood alcohol level required to save lives of people behind the wheel, drunk drivers sort of thing, is really charitable, which is a little weird. And not only that, and taken, I think, in directions which we wouldn't necessarily approve of. There was a case in Canada called Christians for the Abolition of Torture, where they had as I recall, a letter writing campaign to encourage non-Canadian governments that were engaged in torture to stop torturing people. And the court said, well, that's a political activity, which arguably it is. I mean, if it was legal in that country, it shouldn't be able to, changing the law is something that we don't allow as political activity, but we don't allow organizations to be involved in controversial advocacy. But what exactly is controversial about the abolition of torture? I mean, in Canada, that's not controversial. Like, we all agree on that. So the idea of these political activity tests are somewhat subjective. You have to decide, well, what exactly is political, what exactly is controversial. There are allowances, though. The government wrote into the law the ability for charities to be engaged in political activities where those activities are really a small part of their overall ongoing activities, but that's only a small part of the whole puzzle.
Yeah, and I've read that, and I'll kind of highlight that to some of our viewers on the talk, that it's up to 10%, and it's also, and this is the funny thing, is it's also got to be like nonpartisan. It's got to be equal across the board. You can't call out any one party, any one member, any one voting pattern, which it sounds good on paper, but in practicality, I'm like, how is that even possible, right? Because you're going to be, against the current government's law for or against a particular topic, and you'll want it repealed, or you want new laws, and you want, hey, let's vote these guys in because they say that they're going to, they're friendly to your cause. I'm like, in practicality, that's like any, I would think any religious organization would be kind of almost, it would be contrary to their character for for being like, I don't think you could be nonpartisan on many of these things, right? And you, let alone even some kind of like non-religious organizations, they're going to have to call out specific parties and stuff. And I just don't see that being practical in reality.
You're absolutely right. I mean, we could go through examples, but the bottom line is you're right. So much of the way we try to, not be partisan really is a joke. I mean, when an environmental organization says, okay, well, we're not going to be partisan, we're going to display the voting records of all the parties on, let's say, building a new pipeline. Well, we all know where the environmental charity stands on the issue. It's not like it's a secret. And, displaying the voting record, well, these are the parties that voted against the measure, which we think is bad, and these are the parties which voted for the measure we think is bad, is hardly nonpartisan, but it's was something the CRA is just, alleges is, that's totally allowable because on the surface they're just displaying what the voting records are. I mean, it's kind of, a wink, wink, nudge, nudge kind of nonpartisan issue that is promoted by the CRA. I don't understand that position at all.
And I guess, too, a bit of my background is I'm definitely advocating for kind of the religious organizations out of, the 80,000 charities or whatever, is, again, I think speaking out for and against certain things is literally part of the character and mandate of technically some of these of religious organizations. So from the pulpit or, from the front or using, I think in even your speak, kind of assets that are technically the charities or the sphere of charities, they literally already do and or should be doing more of advocacy or against or for something policies. And I'm like, I just don't see how they can do that in good conscience other than, hoping that the government doesn't call them out on it at some point. And I guess that's a little bit of my talk is that there's serious consequences. And just because the government hasn't, called you out on it, at some point they may, and you're going to be in for a shock potentially, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And one of the interesting parts about the political activities test there are organizations out there that take the position that their charitable goal can only be fulfilled through pursuit of through using political means. One such example, I believe, is Canada Without Poverty, which has launched a lawsuit in the Ontario courts on this basis to say that their belief is that the solution to poverty is a redistribution of wealth, and that redistribution of wealth is effectively a political solution, and therefore their charitable goals can only be fulfilled through political means. Now, whether or not you agree with that, the ultimate goal, it's a reasonable point to argue. I mean, yeah, sure, if they took money from other people and gave it to poor people, that would be relief of poverty. It may cause other problems, but it would be the relief of poverty. And yeah, that is a political solution to their to the relief to poverty. And so I take their point, and I think that churches may feel similarly. The biblical exhortations to social justice often require a political solution. And so, if you believe that you have as a divine commandment the pursuit of some of the biblical precepts and that require political activity, then sure, yeah, you're in a bit of a tough bind, because the law in Canada says you can't be both a registered charity and pursue these kind of political activities.
Just can you clear up for me and just kind of paraphrase, is it true that when you go from your private organization and you convert yourself and register as a charity, your organization's assets now convert into the sphere or status of being under a charity, and that all that falls under all those restrictions? Is that correct, or can you expand on that a little bit?
I'm not sure I need to. I think you said it perfectly. You know, if you're not a charity and you own assets, and then you become a charity, your assets or the assets of the charity are now subject to the exact same restrictions as if it had been acquired by a charity rather than a non-charity. So it's all part of the same general classification.
And that will lead us into some of these consequences. Is one of the biggest concerns that I got is whether through volunteer removing of yourself from the charitable status, or involunteer, you know, the government chooses to say, hey, you know, you're messing up on the political purposes thing. You're getting a little bit too vocal about, you know, X, Y, and Z, and we don't believe you're going to be you're not a charity anymore, and they pull the status from you. Can you just speak for just a few seconds on just the consequences of that? Because the biggest concern that I had was that whole revocation tax, which is literally, and that was the kind of the very first question I almost had for you in our initial conversation, was I'm reading this as 100% of your kind of leftover assets, you know, assets minus liabilities, and this revocation tax is going to be 100% the exact amount of the remaining assets. And the biggest concern I have with you is developing this action plan about, well, what does that mean? Like, does that mean the government then, you know, if you own $1 million left over of buildings and stuff, like you get $1 million tax bill? And then I guess the additional question is, like, now how do we move on from that, right? So is that true with this whole revocation tax and afterwards?
Right. So the basic idea is that assets which are acquired by the charitable sector, while they have the benefits of issuing tax receipts, should remain in the charitable sector. So that if an organization has either received as a matter of donations, or donated cash and purchased an item, or used the fact that they are don't pay tax on their income as a way to acquire assets, then if they lose their charitable status, those assets should not become available should not become available to the organization when they don't have those restrictions that belong to other charities, if you follow me. So yes, when an organization loses its charitable status, idea is that they cannot take their assets with them, and those assets remain in the charitable sector. It's a tax of 100% of the assets, more or less. You make a good point that, well, there are deductions for amounts that you spend on your charitable activities, etc. But effectively, the assets owned on the date that the organization is informed that the CRA is going to revoke their charitable status, less any amount that they spend on certain charitable activities in sort of a winding up period and any liabilities, and less any assets that they transfer to another arm's length registered charity during that winding up period. So it's not like the government seizes all those assets. In fact, they don't want to. In my experience, the CRA is not interested in taking the assets of a charity. They much prefer that the assets of the charity be transferred to another organization which will maintain its charitable status after the first organization loses its status.
Okay, fair enough. And again, I read all that, and that's what's obvious. Now, what is not so obvious, and this is the kind of the main reason I wanted kind of just some paraphrase, you know, from an expert, is how can, and this is kind of the exit strategy, the action plan, the hope at the end of the tunnel, is how can a charity move from, and I'll just outright say charity or church, how can a charity or church kind of move from being under the charitable status to a non-charitable status and keep its assets? Is there a way of doing that, and what are the costs for that?
Well, I suppose there are two ways to do it. The first way to do it is an annulment, which I think you're familiar with, which basically means that an organization it's as if it was never registered in the first place. People who received receipts get to keep them. In other words, they don't have to go back and redo their taxes just because the charity they donated to was annulled. But the organization can no longer issue tax receipts, but it gets to keep its assets. So whatever it is acquired to that date, it gets to keep. Now, an annulment is only available in a situation where an organization was registered by the CRA in error, or there's been a change in the law such that that organization would not qualify for charitable status now if it was applying for that status now. That's one way. Another way, which we've used in the past, I mean, is a bit of a sort of a way around this, is we set up two organizations. This is not uncommon. We set up one organization to do the charitable activities, and we set up another organization, which would be a not-for-profit, that does the political activities. And, you know, if you keep things separate and you keep things, you know, proper records of everything, then that second organization actually is the one that will undertake to do the political activities, and the charitable organization continues, you know, keeps its mouth shut about the political activities, but does the you know, ongoing charitable activities.
No, and I'm glad you said that, because that, in my vetting of this, that was kind of one potential scenario. It's like, well, how about we do this, right? You know, and we'll be quiet here and we can speak up over here. And I definitely have some potential issues with that, because it sounds good on paper, but I in practicality, I think if you get down to the, you know, the moral aspects of it, I don't think you actually could separate it as easy as it is on paper. Here's a question for you. So if a charity, and this is just a strategy question, and maybe nobody's done it or you've thought of it, is how can if a church owns, you know, white picket fence church and stuff, you know, $1 million property or something, they want to go from charity status to non-charity status, you know, they want to be publicly vocal about whatever topics they want to be, you know, vocal about, you know, which would be in violation. So for sure they need to be remove themselves. How can they keep their white picket, you know, church? You know, so if they're going to get taxed for $1 million, is it possible to create a trust fund or something that is where they can raise $1 million? That particular trust or organization, I suppose, would pay normal amount of tax on it, and then once they've raised that $1 million, could that not then theoretically pay for that revocation tax bill? And then at that point, you know, they've purchased their freedom. Is that possible? Is that a good strategy?
It is possible, you know, but they would. Yeah, you know, it is possible. I mean, to put it that way, but it would have to be $1 million raised without the benefit of giving tax receipts, which is a bit of a tall order.
Correct, but yeah, with those caveats, or, you know, with that statute saying no, like, you know, we want to be, you know, we want to be above board, we want to be political, as it were. We can't issue tax receipts on this money, and we're going to purchase back our freedom. You know, yes, it's a tall order, but it is possible to raise funds that are not tax receivable to pay for this revocation tax. So
yeah, I mean, it is possible, sure.
Is the way I described it, is that kind of fair? Is that roughly kind of the idea, where you would create a secondary organization that's completely, you know, would be taxed normally, so the government doesn't have any issue, and then that's where you would raise your funds under that particular name? Because the wind-up period, when a charity closes and stuff, you know, you've got to be careful, because like you'd start raising money, you know, to pay your tax bill, but if it's under the same name, it could, you know, the government could then tax you on that same amount of money, right? You know, so no better off.
No, I mean, I don't mean to interrupt, but obviously, if you're going to engage in that kind of a plan, then you know, whoever it is would have to engage in professional advice as a way to figure out how to deal with that. But you know, if you can raise $1 million to do this, why not simply transfer the church to another organization that is quite prepared to have you pray there and conduct your activities there, and raise the $1 million to in a not-for-profit organization to then dedicate to your political activities. Because that to me, you don't need to give the government a penny. The tax can be satisfied by transferring assets to an arm's length registered charity, and the government's happy with that. So why would you pay them $1 million when you don't have to? You might as well use that $1 million for your political activities.
I suppose that definitely needs exploration. I just don't see that possible, because you still want to be in that white picket fence church or something like that, let's say, in the example I gave. I think because of the binding of the obligation is you kind of need to purchase your way out, and then you're free to do. You're back to the freedoms of speech or the freedoms of religion that we have as individuals, but you do not have as a charity. And I think you have to purchase your way out of that. Like I understand that there's kind of ways to separate that or whatever, but I just don't know how that's morally possible, right?
Well, I think it's going to be a matter of circumstance. It may be that it's an option for certain organizations in certain circumstances, and for other organizations less so. That's probably the only real answer.
Now, in conclusion, I appreciate everything. I suppose in conclusion, what do you think? And we kind of opened up our conversation a little bit about it. Is what do you think the chances are of, with laws, changing? A lot of organizations, including religious organizations, are going to find that the laws have changed and they no longer agree with them, and therefore they feel that they have to be political. What do you think the chances are of going down the annulment thing? Like on the Canadian or the CRA website, it's funny because it actually says that the charities themselves cannot request an annulment. But I'm like, well, hey, this is a big thing. So in 2005, we mentioned, the passing of the allowing of the same-sex marriage. Well, I would think that a lot of religious organizations, that's kind of a fairly vocal stance that they make themselves known about. They would now all be qualified for an annulment theoretically. So how can, I know that one's kind of come and gone, but churches that were registered before that theoretically could be annulled. You'd have a harder argument to say, churches say that registered after 2005. But right now we have Bill C-16 that's passing. It's kind of on the sexuality side of things, which again could say we are now in violation of, our character of our charity, and we need to be annulled. Is there a chance that lawyers and stuff can fight and say to, the government of Canada that, hey, now my client here no longer qualifies, they should be annulled? Are we able to put pressure on the CRA to kind of request these annulments?
You raise a very good point. The issue with same-sex marriage was resolved when Parliament actually put a provision in the Income Tax Act saying that charities will not be revoked for failure to solemnize a same-sex marriage. And in a case that I argued with some others about 7 or 8 years ago now, the court decided that the granting of annulment is discretionary by the CRA. So there's really no way to force them to annul. But in my experience, the CRA is happy to cull the number of charities. And if a charity approaches the CRA, they are open to discussion about the situation and may well agree that annulment is an appropriate route. These things can be discussed with them. So I would suggest that if there are people out there that do feel that they are now in in a position where they are fundamentally, they would not have qualified for registration if they applied now, it's worth a conversation with the CRA to see if they are prepared to annul. And while it's discretionary, there's nothing to say that the CRA will not use that discretion.
Wow. No, that sounds great, and I definitely appreciate that, and that's a great note to leave our conversation on, because again, a part of my discussion is to bring light to the seriousness of this sphere of charity thing, bring to light so people aren't ignorant of it, because from a moral standpoint, they could be theoretically crossing the line and kind of breaking their own agreements with the government, and they don't even necessarily know. And from a moral standpoint, I think that just because they're getting away with it doesn't make it correct. And
right.
And at the same time, as a warning that theoretically they are in violation. So what they're currently what their current reality is going to be potentially yanked from underneath them at any point in time in the future, and it's not going to be pretty if it's not on their timetable.
Right.
So,
right. Well, I think you've got a good sense of it.
Okay, no, I totally appreciate your expertise and your advice and stuff. Now, how just for our listeners and viewers and stuff, like, what's the best way to get a hold of you and your firm and yeah.
Well, the best way to find me is probably on our website. It's www.rache.ca, and my name, of course, is Adam, and I'm the only Adam in the firm, so they'll find me.
That is awesome. And again, thank you so very much. And I'm going to definitely encourage our viewers and listeners to write in their questions to myself, and maybe in the future I might be able to compile a bit of a fact for you or something, and maybe we can have some additional conversations in the future, Kevin. Or Kevin, I'm Adam. Yeah, I'm Kevin. I know, that's the thing. You're Adam.
No problem. Well, it sounds like fun. So anytime.
Awesome. Well, much appreciated, Adam. And yeah, have a great day.
Thank you. You too. Take care.
Yeah. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
Good. My pleasure. So use it, and I'll send me a link to it when it's up.
Yeah, you bet. Yeah, because I'll be kind of I'll kind of transcribe some of it, be able to use a bit of some quotes, and yeah, as I get the entire presentation kind of wrapping up, I'll definitely run it by you, because again, some of this is, if one person kind of, I don't want to be crying chicken little here, but if you get another outside source saying, no, this is a serious matter, and you are correct in your reading of the government's website, and it's like, okay, well, now I got some backing on that, and it's not much. It's like, hey, you can read it and I can read it, but just having that third party is definitely adds some credibility to any presentation. So
it's one of my first interviews, so please be kind. I'm a little rough in my questioning. I wasn't as prepared as I wanted to be, but the information is sound. Adam is amazing. And if you have concerns, you definitely you should have a chat with me, both on the Christian side of things and then on the legal side of things. You can confirm with Adam, but or any other good charity lawyer, because you can read it right on the Canada's website. Our churches own nothing, and they're not really churches, and they don't have the protections of the charter rights and freedoms as a real church would. So enjoy the interview.